Stories Between Us anthology, where Black queer men's lives, love, and tension take center stage. Apollo arrived at the farm before sunrise, like he always did. He parked near the equipment shed, cut the engine, and sat for a moment before getting out. The air was cool enough to feel sharp in his lungs. He pulled his jacket tighter, rolled his shoulders once, and started toward the barn. He had worked places like this most of his adult life. Farms, ranches, and properties where the days were long and the expectations were clear. Show up. Do the work. Don't talk too much. Don't ask questions that made people uncomfortable. He had learned how to fit into those rules early, and fitting had kept him employed. Luke noticed him before Apollo noticed Luke. Luke was already inside the barn, boots planted in the dirt, checking the feed bins. He had been raised on this land and carried himself like someone who knew where everything belonged. He didn't rush, but he didn't waste time either. When he turned and saw Apollo coming in, he nodded once in greeting. Apollo nodded back. That was how it started. No conversation. No introductions beyond names exchanged once, weeks earlier. Just two men working in the same space, aware of each other without needing to explain why. Apollo's body told its own story. His shoulders were broad from years of lifting. His arms were thick, skin darkened unevenly by the sun. His hands were rough, nails short, knuckles scarred in places where tools had slipped or wire had bitten. He kept his hair cut close, beard trimmed only when it got in the way. His clothes were worn because he wore them, not because he wanted them to look that way. Luke looked different, but not softer. He was leaner, his strength shaped by repetition rather than force. His hands were cleaner, but not delicate. His face held the lines of someone who spent his days outdoors, squinting into light, thinking through problems before acting on them. He wore the same boots every day, same jacket, same shirts washed thin with use. They worked side by side for weeks. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was about the work, gates that needed fixing. Weather coming in, animals acting up. Luke explained things once and didn't repeat himself. Apollo listened and did what was asked. They settled into a rhythm that felt natural without being discussed. Apollo noticed Luke in pieces. The way he bent to lift something heavy without bracing unnecessarily. The way he wiped his hands on his jeans before touching tools. The way his voice stayed even, whether he was tired or frustrated. Luke noticed Apollo too. How he carried weight without complaint. How he finished tasks completely instead of halfway. How he stood a little apart from the others during breaks, eating quietly, eyes on the ground. Neither of them named the noticing. The days were physical. Long hours under the sun. Shirts damp with sweat by mid-morning. The kind of work that made your body feel used by the end of the day. Apollo liked that feeling. It meant he wouldn't lie awake later thinking too much. Luke liked the quiet that came with it. The first time Luke stood close behind Apollo, it was because the wind had picked up suddenly. Cold air cut through the barn, sharp enough to sting. Luke stepped closer without thinking, positioning himself so his body blocked some of the wind while Apollo worked on a latch that wouldn't cooperate. Apollo felt his body heat up immediately. Luke didn't touch him. Not at first. He stood close enough that Apollo could feel his breath at the back of his neck, close enough that the space between them closed without warning. Apollo paused, waiting for the moment to pass. It didn't. Luke stayed where he was, his chest pressed lightly into Apollo's back. Not forceful, not demanding, just there. Apollo didn't move away. That was the first sign of the tension between them. Luke's arms rested along Apollo's sides, not wrapping, not tightening, just contact, enough to be felt. Apollo felt something in his body loosen that he hadn't realized was tight. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His breathing slowed. They stayed like that for several seconds. Long enough for Apollo to register that Luke wasn't asking for anything. Long enough for Luke to realize Apollo wasn't pulling away. Then Luke stepped back, cleared his throat once, and moved on to the next task. Nothing was said. After that, Luke stood behind Apollo more often, close enough to be felt, close enough that Apollo didn't have to turn around to know he was there. Luke stayed within arm's reach while Apollo worked. Apollo leaned back when Luke stood behind him, just enough to feel him there. In the evenings, they sat shoulder to shoulder on the truck bed and waited for the day to end. Neither of them said a word about it. At night, Apollo lay on his narrow bed in the room he rented down the road, boots kicked off, body still sore from the day. He thought about Luke standing behind him, about the heat of his chest and the pressure of his arms. He thought about what it would be like if that hold lasted longer, if Luke didn't step back, if the closeness turned into something else. The thoughts surprised him, not because they felt wrong, but because he hadn't let himself want that kind of sex in a long time. Luke noticed the change in himself too. How he watched Apollo more closely. How he adjusted his pace to match his. How he found reasons to work near him without making it obvious. He had spent his life taking care of things. Land, animals, responsibilities passed down without question. Being close to Apollo felt different. Less like duty, more like a choice. One evening, the cold came fast and the power flickered on and off. Luke told Apollo to sit by the heater in the main house until it passed. They sat at opposite ends of the couch. Luke moved first, close enough that his knee touched Apollo's thigh. He rested an arm along the back of the couch, his forearm grazing Apollo's shoulder. Luke's hand stayed there, solid and warm. He squeezed once, testing what reaction he might get. Apollo leaned back into him without looking. Luke's other arm came around his chest, holding him in place. Both their hands started to explore each other. Luke's fingers pressed into Apollo's arm, then slid down to his side, gripping muscle through fabric. Apollo reached back, found Luke's thigh, grabbed it hard, then loosened his hold. Luke's hand dipped under Apollo's shirt just enough to feel skin. They didn't pull away. They touched like that for a while, just hands learning, pressure checking, bodies responding. When the heater shut off, they pressed closer together. Apollo slept on the couch that night. Luke brought him a blanket and let his hand rest on Apollo's shoulder longer than necessary. In the morning, they went back to work, but the touching didn't stop. One afternoon, weeks later, Luke's hand slipped to Apollo's chest while they stood together. Not intentional at first. Apollo covered Luke's hand with his own and held it there. That was the moment they both understood this was something they were choosing. They stayed together through the season, through the work, through the quiet understanding that this didn't need a future promised out loud to be real in the present. One night, a stillness settles over the farm in a way that feels thicker than usual. The work is done. The animals are quiet, The only light comes from the moon and the small lamp hanging near the chicken coop, casting soft shadows across the dirt. Apollo and Luke don't plan it. They end up there, because they always do at the end of long days checking locks, making sure everything's secure. Luke reaches for Apollo first. He cups the back of Apollo's neck and pulls him in. And this time, Apollo doesn't pause. He kisses him fully, openly, like he's been holding it back for weeks. They lean into each other, hard bodies pressed together, hands roaming with intention instead of restraint. They stay there behind the chicken coop for a long time, tangled up in each other, finally letting go and exploring every inch of each other's bodies, laughing softly, holding on to the moment. The world narrows to their warmth, their touch, and the feeling that something has finally crossed a line it was always heading toward. Later, they sit on the ground behind the coop, shoulders touching, Apollo's jacket draped over both of them. The night air cools their skin, but neither of them moves away. That's when Apollo says it. He tells Luke about the new property, about his new work contract, about how he's supposed to leave in a few days. He admits that before tonight, he thought he'd just go, the way he always does. Then he looks at Luke and tells him he doesn't want to do that anymore. He asks Luke to come with him, not as a promise for forever, not as a plan carved in stone, just as a choice to see what happens when they try, when they don't leave something good behind just because it scares them. Luke doesn't answer right away. He looks out over the land he's known his whole life. Then he looks back at Apollo. He smiles, slow and sure, and says yes. The next morning, they load Luke's things into Apollo's truck as the sun comes up, the farm bathed in morning light. They share one last look at the place that brought them together. They drive off down a long road, windows open, hands finding each other between the seats. Not because everything is figured out, but because love finally gave them somewhere to go together. Thank you for listening to Stories Between Us Anthology. You can find every episode on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Rate the show and leave a comment. It helps more people find us.